What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's the Shield Brother here for the History Armada. Today we're talking about feudalism and what it was. Feudalism was the dominant social system in medieval Europe, and it lasted for a very long time. Oftentimes it's even discussed in middle school and high school classes, but never really delved into or explained. So today we're going to take a look at that and explain a little bit about what it was. It was basically in which the nobility held lands given by the crown in exchange for military service, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants, or called serfs sometimes, were obliged to live on their lord's land and give him homage, labor, and a share of the produce that they made on the land. It was in exchange for military protection that they would give these services. So, feudalism. Feudalism was a combination of legal and military customs in medieval Europe that flourished between the 9th and 15th centuries. Broadly defined, it was a way of structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land in exchange for service or labors. Although derived from the Latin word feudum or feudum or fiefdom, that's where we get that word, then in use, the term feudalism and the system it describes were not conceived of as a formal political system by the people living in the Middle Ages, but rather feudalism was a term later made up. In its classic definition, feudalism describes a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations among the warrior nobility revolving around the three key concepts of lords, vassals, and fiefs. A broader definition of feudalism, as described by Mark Bloch from 1939, includes not only the obligations of the warrior nobility, but also those of all three estates of the realm: the nobility estate, the clergy, and the peasantry, bound by a manualism that is sometimes referred to as a feudal society. It was the systematic norm for each of these estates to work together in a way under the crown. Here you can kind of see a pyramid example of what the feudalism kind of looked like. The Tyranny of a Construct, a book written in 1974 by Elizabeth A.R. Brown and Susan Reynolds, Fiefs and Vassals from 1994, there has been ongoing inconclusive discussions among medieval historians as to whether feudalism is a useful construct for understanding medieval society, or really just a romantic made-up term for the system. So it's kind of debated whether it was needed or not. So the origins of the idea. The terms feudalism and feudal system were generally applied to the early and central Middle Ages, the period from the 5th century, when central political authority in the Western Empire of Rome disappeared, and to the 12th century, when kingdoms began to emerge as effective centralized units of government. For a relatively brief period, from the mid-8th to the early 9th century, the Carolingian rulers, especially Pippin, who reigned from 751 to 768, and Charlemagne, who reigned from 768-771 to 1814, had remarkable success in creating and maintaining a relatively unified empire. Before and afterward, however, political units were fragmented and political authority was diffused. The mightier of the later Carolingians attempted to regulate local magnates and magistrates and enlist them into their service. But the power of local elites was never effaced or erased. It was never really changed. The local elites still had their standing. That's kind of where the seedlings of the nobility class kind of started to take place. In the absence of forceful kings or emperors, local lords expanded the territory subject to them and intensified their control over the people living there. In many areas, the term feudum, as well as the terms beneficium and casamentum, came to be used to describe a form of property holding and sharecropping. The holdings these terms denoted have often been considered central dependent tenures, over which their holders' rights were notably limited. As the words were used in documents of this period, however, the characteristics of the holdings that these upper elites had are difficult to distinguish from those of tenures designated by such words as allodium, which has generally been translated as freeholding property. Fiefs still existed all the way to the 17th century, when the feudal model, or as contemporary historians like to call it, the feudal construct, was developed. At the time, the fief was a piece of property, usually land, that was held in return for service, which could include military duties. The fief or fief holder swore fidelity to the person from whom the fief was held, the lord, the king, whatever, and became his or her man. The ceremony in which the oath was taken was called an homage or homage, from the Latin homo, which means man. These institutions survived in England until they were abolished by Parliament in 1645. So this is where we get like the bannermen of England and France, all these fiefdoms, all these knights, all these bannermen that would take homage and be their loyal subjects. Or I say loyal very loosely. But until their eradication of the fiefdoms by the National Assembly between 1789 and 1793 in France, they had considerable importance in France, where they were employed to create and reinforce familial and social bonds. This made students of the past eager to understand how they had come into being, like why did these fiefs exist? Similarities of terminology and practice found in documents surviving from the Middle Ages, called the Liber Feodorum, or the Book of Fiefs, an Italian compilation of customs relating to property holding, which was made in the 12th century and incorporated into Roman law, led historians and lawyers to search for the origins of fiefdoms and feudalism with feudal institutions in the Middle Ages. So the fiefs. The fiefs are defined by scholars in the 17th century. The medieval feudal system was characterized by the absence of public authority and the exercise of power by local lords of administrative and judicial functions performed by centralized governments. General disorder and endemic conflict, and the prevalence of bonds between lords and the free dependents or vassals, which were forged by the lord's bestowal of property, called fiefs, and by the perception of homage from these vassals. These bonds entailed the rendering of services by vassals to their lords, the military obligations, counsel, financial support, etc., and the lord's obligation to protect and respect their vassals. These characteristics were in part deduced from medieval documents and chronicles, but they were interpreted in light of the 17th century practices and semantics. Learned legal commentaries of the law, giving and governing the property called fiefs, or fiefs, also affected interpretation of the sources. So that's kind of where the fief and the fiefs come into play, that's where they get established, and that's what it kind of is, until the feudal revolution in France. In its origin, the feudal revolution in France, the feudal grant of land had been seen in terms of personal bond between lord and vassal, but with time and the transformation of fiefs into hereditary holdings, the nature of the system came to be seen as a form of politics of land. The 11th century in France saw that what has been called by historians a feudal revolution or mutation and a fragmentation of powers. That's also from Bloch. That was unlike the development of feudalism in England or Italy or Germany in the same period or later. Counties and duchies began to break down into smaller holdings as Castilians and lesser significant people took control of local lands. This is happening in France. It does not happen in Germany or England. And that's where the feudal breakdown starts to begin. Lesser lords usurped or privatized a wide range of the rights to the state, the land, and the fees, and the market dues, and the travel fees. This fragmentation of powers was not, however, systematic throughout France, and in certain counties such as Flanders, Normandy, Anjou, and Toulouse, counts were able to maintain control of their lands until the 12th century or later. Thus, in some regions like Normandy and Flanders, the vassal feudal system was an effective tool for controlling and linking vassals to their lords. But in other regions of France, the system led to significant confusion, all the more so as vassals could and frequently did pledge themselves to 2 or more lords. In response to this, the idea of a liege lord was developed, where the where the obligations to one lord is regarded as superior in the 12th century. So the fiefs were the peasants, and these peasants had a lord, and then these lords in France were starting to decide that they wanted to promise themselves to more than one higher up. That's why the liege lord became a thing in France. This was not a problem in England and Germany. In England and Germany, the fiefs did their thing under their lord, and the vassal was loyal to their lord. They did not have this issue of fragmentation and a feudal revolution like France did. So the end of feudalism in Europe became in 1500 and 1850s. This is a French map showing that fragmentation from France in 1477. You can see all of the different duchies, lands, houses, royal domains, etc. This is a really good map showing that off from 1477. But, like I said, the end of European feudalism came in 1500 to the 1850s, where it slowly died off. Feudalism effectively ended by about 1500. This was partly since the military shifted from armies consisting of the nobility to a professional fighter army, thus reducing the nobility's claim of power, but also because the Black Death had reduced the nobility's hold over all of the lower classes. Vestiges of the feudal system hung on in France until the French Revolution, and the system lingered on in parts of Central and Eastern Europe as late as the 1850s with the different revolutions within Central Germany and Italy. Russia was the last one to abolish serfdom in 1861. Even when the original feudal relationships had disappeared and broken down, there were many institutional remnants of feudalism left in place. So it's like the early stage of the French Revolution, it showed the feudal order had remnants, and the National Assembly abolished the feudal system entirely. But without debate, the Assembly enthusiastically adopted equality of taxation and redemption of all manorial rights except for those involving personal servitude. Other proposals followed with the same success: the equality of legal punishment, the equality of office, payment, freedom of worship. All of that came from the National Assembly during the French Revolution, where it finally got rid of these feudal remnants in its government. Originally, the peasants were supposed to pay for the release of dues. These dues affected more than a fourth of the farmland in France and provided most of the income of the larger landowners. So you can see where the serfs would be very unhappy and have a terrible life. The majority refused to pay, and in 1793 the obligation was cancelled by the assembly. Thus the peasants got their land free and also no longer paid the tithe to the church. So feudalism really is a simple yet complex thing. It was a pyramid, but it was also a web of different relationships and ties and promises and vows. So, the evolution of the concept of a feudal state or period in the sense of either a regime or a period dominated by lords who possess financial or social power and prestige became widely held in the middle of the 18th century as a result of works such as Montesquieu's De l'Esprit de l'Eau and other similar books published in English and German, which talked about, historical accounts of the ancient parliaments of France and the States General of the kingdom, etc. In the 18th century, writers of the Enlightenment wrote about feudalism to show that it was antiquated. It was a broken regime. This was the age of Enlightenment, when writers valued reason, and the Middle Ages are viewed as the Dark Ages. This is where that term comes from, the Enlightenment age, so we call it the Dark Ages for the Middle Ages. Enlightenment authors generally mocked and ridiculed anything from the Dark Ages, including and especially feudalism, projecting its negative characteristics on the current French monarchy as a means of political gain. For them, feudalism meant privileges and inequality among the people. When the French Assembly abolished the feudal regime in August of 1789, this is what was meant. Adam Smith used the term feudal system to describe a social and economic system defined by inherited social ranks, each of which possessed inherent social and economic privileges and obligations depending on what rank you were. In such a system, wealth derived from agriculture, which was arranged not according to market forces, but on the basis of customary labor services owed by serfs to land-owning nobles, who then had their own tithes to pay. So, Karl Marx drew a lot from this. This does not necessarily have a lot to do with feudalism itself, but feudalism had a large effect on this man. Karl Marx also used the term in the 19th century in his analysis of society's economic and political development, describing feudalism, or more accurately, he described a feudal society, or the feudal mode of production, as the order coming before capitalism. He kind of blamed feudalism for the inequality of man. For Marx, what defined feudalism was the power of the ruling class and the aristocracy in their control of the land and leading the working classes, based upon the exploitation of the peasants who farmed these lands under serfdom and principalities and etc., which by means of force or servitude, labor, produce, and money was paid as rents. Marx defined feudalism primarily by its economic characteristics. He also took it as a paradigm for understanding the power relationships between capitalists and the wage laborers in his own time. He called it, and I quote, "in a pre-capitalist system, and it was obvious that most people did not control their own destiny. Under feudalism, for instance, serfs had to work for their lords. Capitalism seems different because people are in theory free to work for themselves and for others as they choose, yet most workers have as little control over their lives as feudal serfs did then." End quote. Some later Marxist theorists, such as Eric Wolf, have applied this label to include non-European societies, grouping feudalism together with Imperial Chinese and pre-Columbian Incan societies due to their tributary statuses. Thank you for watching. That was a short video about feudalism, what it was, and its effect it had on human history. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned. If you liked, go ahead and leave me a like. Hit that subscribe button for me. If you have a comment, suggestion, or concern, you can always leave that down for me in the comment section down below. This has been the Shield Brother for the History Armada, and I'll catch y'all next time.
Leave a dislike.